Were Vikings really just savage raiders, or something far more complicated? Did a bunch of Northmen suddenly decide to conquer Italy, and why did nobody stop them? What if the Pope himself got captured and then negotiated? Let's dive into the messy, thrilling, and utterly bizarre story of how a band of adventurers from Scandinavia turned the south of Italy into their personal playground. The air in 1054 smelled of salt, sweat, and simmering resentment. Pope Leo IX, a man more accustomed to incense and theological debates, found himself staring down the barrel of a Norman sword. Not a particularly impressive sword, mind you, more like a slightly battered, rather enthusiastic piece of steel, but effective nonetheless. He'd set out to crush these newcomers, the Normans, and ended up as their unwilling guest, a gilded prisoner in the heart of their latest conquest. It wasn't exactly how he'd envisioned his papal summer. Let's rewind a bit. The 11th century in Italy was less a unified kingdom, and more a chaotic jigsaw puzzle. For centuries, the peninsula had been battered and reshaped by waves of invaders: Greeks, Romans, yes, those Romans, though a very, very distant echo, Lombards, Byzantines, the Eastern Romans, still clinging to their empire, Arabs, and a whole host of other guys with ambitions and axes. The result? A patchwork of squabbling principalities, each claiming a piece of the ancient glory, each more interested in grabbing the biggest slice than in actually governing anything. The Basilius, the Byzantine emperor, was nominally in charge of southern Italy, but he was about as effective as a damp sponge. The Holy Roman Emperor, a German king with a fancy title, also fancied himself the ruler of the whole show, but his attention was usually elsewhere, battling rebellious Saxons and Bavarians, for example. And then there were the local lords, the princes and nobles, who mostly just wanted to be rich and powerful and didn't particularly care who they stole from to get there. Then came the Normans. They weren't exactly born in Italy. These guys hailed from Normandy, a little corner of northern France that had been settled by Vikings. Yes, Vikings back in the 9th century. These weren't the terrifying, longboat-launching berserkers of legend, though. They traded their axes for swords, their pagan rituals for Christianity, and their raiding for, well, raiding, but with a bit more organization. They'd become incredibly successful feudal lords themselves, ruled by powerful dukes who were more interested in building castles and collecting taxes than pillaging monasteries. Rollo, the first Norman leader in the region, had even been formally baptized, 100 captives sacrificed in his honor, naturally, proving that assimilation was a key part of the Norman strategy. Now, these Normans weren't content with just keeping themselves busy. They had a restless spirit, a thirst for adventure, and a knack for getting into trouble. And they spotted a weakness in Italy: a whole lot of squabbling, a weak central government, and plenty of wealthy landowners ripe for the taking. Their arrival in southern Italy in the early 11th century was disruptive, to say the least. They started small, raiding coastal towns and harassing local lords. Then they began to build up their own forces, recruiting mercenaries and forming alliances with disgruntled nobles. They weren't exactly interested in imposing a new order. They were mostly interested in grabbing what they could and running. The Campania region around Naples was particularly vulnerable. It was a fertile farming area controlled by 3 Lombard principalities: Benevento, Capua, and Salerno, each of which was more concerned with fighting amongst themselves than with defending against a foreign invasion. Meanwhile, Naples, Amalfi, and Gaeta were thriving trading cities, nominally loyal to Constantinople but essentially running their own show. And of course, Byzantium itself was a distant, preoccupied empire, more worried about defending its eastern borders than policing the Italian peninsula. Enter Humphrey Hauteville. He wasn't a king, or even a particularly impressive nobleman. He was just a Norman adventurer, a skilled warrior, and a ruthless negotiator. He and his brother Robert Guiscard launched a series of daring raids into Apulia, the region around modern-day Puglia, utterly terrifying the local population. They weren't trying to conquer, they were trying to annoy. They'd loot, burn, and generally cause mayhem, then retreat before the locals could mount a serious defense. It was a remarkably effective strategy. Pope Leo IX, a man who preferred papal pronouncements to battlefield tactics, decided to take matters into his own hands. He raised an army, a motley crew of Italian mercenaries, German knights, and a few bewildered Swabian swordsmen who, sadly, didn't fare too well. The goal? To crush the Normans and restore order to southern Italy. The Battle of Civitate in 1055 was a disaster. The papal army was routed. Humphrey Hauteville, a surprisingly effective commander, led a brilliant counterattack, scattering the papal forces and capturing the papal standard. Pope Leo IX was captured, along with a significant portion of the papal entourage. Now, this is where things get really interesting. Leo wasn't simply imprisoned, he was held as a guest, a very reluctant guest, in the Hauteville's camp. He was allowed to conduct papal business, to write letters, and even to hold court, but he was constantly reminded of his predicament. The Normans, lounging around the gates of his chambers, made it abundantly clear that his freedom depended on their goodwill. Negotiations dragged on for 9 agonizing months. The papal historians of the time, predictably, spun a heroic tale of Leo's victory, claiming he had successfully subdued the Normans and secured their submission. The reality was far more pragmatic. The Normans, led by Humphrey, had simply extracted a favorable agreement. They were recognized as the rulers of the territories they had conquered, granted official titles, and assured of their future privileges. In exchange, they promised to behave themselves, a promise they promptly broke a few years later, but the story didn't end there. Simultaneously, the Holy Roman Emperor Henry III was also vying for control of southern Italy. He saw the Normans as a threat to his own authority and attempted to undermine them, but his efforts were hampered by a rebellion in Germany and a troublesome war with Hungary. And then there was Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire, who claimed the territory as their own, but were too preoccupied with their own internal struggles and Eastern threats to mount a serious defense. Meanwhile, the Normans, emboldened by their success, continued to expand their territory. They conquered Sicily, a strategically vital island that had been ruled by Arabs for centuries. They pushed further into mainland Italy, establishing new principalities and consolidating their power. The political landscape of southern Italy became a chaotic free-for-all, with the Normans, the Byzantines, the Holy Roman Emperor, and the popes all vying for control. It was a tangled web of alliances, betrayals, and shifting loyalties. The situation reached a head in 1054, the very year Pope Leo IX died. His successor, Pope Gregory VII, found himself in an even more precarious position than his predecessor. The Normans were now a major power in southern Italy, and the papacy had no effective means of controlling them. Gregory VII attempted to rally support against the Normans, but his efforts were largely unsuccessful. The German emperors were too busy fighting wars in their own territories, and the Byzantines were too preoccupied with their own problems. The local lords of southern Italy were too busy squabbling amongst themselves to offer any meaningful assistance. In the end, the Normans continued to thrive, transforming southern Italy into a Norman kingdom. Their descendants would go on to establish powerful dynasties that would shape the history of Italy for centuries to come. The legacy of Viking adventurers, transformed into Italian kings, was complete. So the next time you think about Italy, remember this: beneath the pasta, the art, and the ancient ruins lies a story of conquest, betrayal, and a band of Northmen who turned a chaotic region into their own personal empire. And it all started with a captured pope and a very persistent sword. But what if the Normans hadn't conquered Italy? What if the Byzantine Empire had managed to hold onto its territory and southern Italy had remained a distant, obscure province? Would Italy be a vastly different place today?